Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fifth webinar of the S4R webinar series. I can see there are some people online, and we also have some people on the phone, so glad that you're all here. In this webinar, given to you by Melanoma Patient Network Europe and the World Duchenne Organization, you will learn all the ins and outs on pseudoscience. And at the end of this hour-long webinar, you know how to detect fake science and how to effectively deal with it. So this webinar is given to you by Giuliosa Spiri-Bernard. She's been a patient advocate since 2014 when she founded Melanoma France and became a vice president of the Melanoma Patient Network Europe. My name is Suzy-Ann Bakker. I'm the communications coordinator of the World Duchenne Organization, and I'll be your host for tonight. The WDO is a worldwide collaboration between patient organizations to improve the lives of those affected by Duchenne and Becker muscular dystrophy. And that is pretty much the main reason why we've partnered up with so many other organizations in this S4R project. So just for following along, this webinar will be recorded and made available for replay later on via a YouTube channel, where you can also find the other S4R webinars. So if you haven't already, just check them out on S4R YouTube channel. If any time during the webinar you want to ask a question, you can use the comment box on the right if you're on the desktop, and the chat box below if you're attending on mobile. And afterwards, you can always ask some questions or comments by sending an email to info@s4r.org. So I'd like to start off with a brief introduction of the S4R project and their goals, and then Julie will proceed on our webinar on pseudoscience. And after that, we'll have some time for answering some questions that we've curated from the comment box. So first, what is S4R? We're actually an EU-funded project that started at Saint Joan de Dieu Research Foundation in Barcelona that uses collective intelligence to drive rare disease research. So 7 organizations joined forces to create a network to learn from each other in terms of sharing knowledge and expertise. And we do that by bringing the rare disease community together based on shared interests or shared experiences, and encouraging you to become citizen scientists that can lead to new insights and starting points to kickstart patient-based research. So how do we actually do that? Well, right now, the S4R website is up and running, and the 2nd of April, we introduced the second layer of the platform that will explain how we connect the rare disease world in a safe and a validated way. So stay tuned and follow us on social media to see how we will do that. And currently, we're piloting this project in 2 rare disease areas, which are the pediatric rare tumors and the neuromuscular disorders. So if you're in one of these particular rare disease areas and you want to enhance research to improve treatment and quality of life, don't hesitate and email us on info@s4r.org. But for now, I'd like to introduce Gilly and her webinar on pseudoscience. She's actually a former geologist who became involved in the melanoma advocacy when her husband became a stage 4 patient. And in 2014, she founded Melanoma France and became the vice president of Melanoma Patient Network Europe. Gilly, welcome. It's so good to have you here. The floor is yours.
Hi there. Thank you very much for that, Susie. I first want to apologize for my voice. I've just come back from 5 days of conference with a lot of presentations. So please add to the questions if there's anything that you don't hear or you can't hear the pronunciation. I'm delighted to be doing this webinar on pseudoscience. It's something that's very close to my heart. And as a carer of a patient for many years, I know what it's like to be exposed to this kind of problem. So I would like to just start. Can we put the slide forward? Okay, that's fine. I've got control. This is the kind of thing we see all the time. I think all of us knows what it's like to be exposed to this, whether it's on social media, whether it's on the normal channels of media, whether it's from our friends and family. It's let me just go. Can we go one back just while I'm talking about? Thank you. we all know what this is like, from how to eat healthily to really clean pseudoscience that is very, very tempting. And in the rare disease space, we are actually even more vulnerable to this because we're often in disease areas where there are no approved treatments. There's no genetic markers that we can target. So our people are really desperate. And what we want to do is really equip them to decide what actually is evidence-based and what is not. So this stuff we need to actually be able to write off if it's rubbish and approve if it's right. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. Okay, now, so what I want to really start with really is that we're at a time where many people are very critical and mistrustful of experts. And we've seen this in climate change, we've seen this in politics, and we've always had it to a certain degree in healthcare, but our exposure to it is much greater than it used to be. But this is both bad and good because we also have access, a much wider access to good information as well as the bad. We have also had a problem in the past that these so-called experts and scientists had a certain arrogance and a very paternalistic attitude, and a reticence to sort of get involved in criticizing fake news. So there's the blame lies in all sorts of factors. But these Mertonian laws were established at the war, which was a time where we really realized that we need to be certain of evidence-based science. Looking for science that was really good for all and not just for the few. Can we go on one slide? So there are three main reasons why we are affected by this. Sorry, I'm just going to go back one forward. We've got a little bit of delay in the slides, but anyway. So there's a philosophical reason to why we want to separate good science from pseudoscience, and that's just we generally want to improve the knowledge of mankind. We should all be trying to pursue the truth and try and get rid of the stuff that's not correct. There's also a civic reason in that our health systems are all under pressure, and we shouldn't be paying for treatments that don't work. We do not have systems now that can support even current therapies and current treatments. So pseudoscientific treatments we should just not be accepting. And then there's the ethical reason. We should care where poor science threatens the welfare or the life of a person, or even just defraud them of money, and basically just what gets in the way of them using treatments that are useful at the time for them. So we need to really try and fight this. So let's do one more slide. Can you put it on one more? There we go. Thank you. So first of all, we want to know why we are tempted by pseudoscience, and hope is the main reason that we're tempted. It's a very, what we call a confounding and powerful factor, and losing hope for some of us can stop us being proactive, but it really complicates things too, because we all suffer from what's called selective confirmation bias. We look, which basically means that we look for the things that we sort of believe in, and we try and ignore the things that we don't really believe and sometimes don't really understand. And we all like to be right, so we never get the whole picture. And also then once we start on an unproven therapy or treatment that we've pulled out of the web or out of the internet, we can then suffer from what's called sunk cost fallacy, which is if you've already spent money and time and effort on something, then you feel the need to justify the decisions that you made before. You become too invested in it, and then you get really defensive about it. And we need to be really aware of this because it's a very sensitive area, and we're dealing with people who are desperate, and we need to be aware of all the factors that people use to choose to be tempted by pseudoscience. And then there's also Darwin's observation that ignorance begets confidence, because we know the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. So we need to try and also educate patients in their disease area, in all the other aspects, to basically make them able to make decisions that are wise for them. And the type of the last thing I want to say is the think positive message. This does actually drive people to, sometimes you get it from your family, sometimes you get it from yourself, sometimes you get pressure from the world, if you like, to say you must think positive. And this leads people to have to take steps, because when you're sitting around on no treatment because there isn't one, or you're waiting for a treatment to come up, or you're waiting for results, the temptation to think positive is also to take action, and we must take make very care that this is not taking action in the wrong direction. We owe it to our patients, so both education and understanding. Okay, let's go on to the next slides. Okay, so sorry, one back. This one I really like, because we all know what it's like. We are rushed through our healthcare systems. We never have time to talk to people. We never have really time to discuss. And so a reassuring lie where we can spend some time with someone who may be telling us rubbish, but we feel loved and we feel cared for, is a lot better than an inconvenient truth where we probably get told the news that we don't want to hear, and probably in a very rushed manner that we don't feel appreciated at all. So let's go on one more. So pseudoscience kind of appears in lots of different forms, and it's sometimes very clever. And we see it not just in science, we see it on our shampoo, we see it all over our TVs. But there's a basic anatomy of a pseudoscience article, which starts with, it's usually in a dubious source, because if there isn't any evidence, you cannot usually manage to publish in a decent publication. So if it sort of says sunflower and health today, it's usually a dubious source. And also, people are very good, people who are involved in pseudoscience are very good at citing themselves. They will cite that there's research out there, and if they've cited themselves, it seems like it's the research, but you need to always check who's citing the sources. And then they also start with something we all agree on, exercise is good for your health. Eating healthfully is good for your health. A balanced diet. We can, all of these things we know are true. So it draws us in with this universal truths. And then they state their case. And it's usually something that they've picked up, that some aspect of a diet or food stuff or a product has been correlated with a longer survival rate. The problem is something being put together with a longer survival does not mean that that is the cause of a longer survival. So we need to be very careful of this correlation and causality and test it at every opportunity. And then they usually put in a bunch of science-sounding jargon, talking about cells and all kinds of things that many people may not understand. But if we educate our patient networks to appreciate how the disease works and how our bodies work, then they usually shouldn't be tricked by this. Then they make an extraordinary claim, because we know in our medical world we don't get extraordinary claims. It's usually, we hope this will work for 30% of people, or we're hoping that this can increase some progression-free survival. They're never extraordinary claims, and this is the other reason why people latch onto it, because they all say things like 100% cure rate, but we know that there's never any evidence there. They usually provide a nice single case study to prove whatever it is they're pushing. Often it's a celebrity, but very often it's, my mother did this and she's now cured. And we all know in science that single case studies do not work. Excuse me. And then they also make an excuse for why this isn't standard of care. So they usually say something like, oh, the pharmaceutical industry and our doctors don't want you to know this because they can't make any money out of it. That's a very common one we see. And so, you know, or the research is never taken up, or we can never get our stuff published because there's some kind of conspiracy. So, and then they obviously, you know, they want to sell something on the whole, or sell a principle, or get you to some clinic or other. So then they let you know where you can buy it. This is usually through some other little sublink. So it's not something that you see on the same page that you're looking at. And then the last thing is, of course, there's no references. You know, maybe the citation that they've made themselves, but there's no real references. So these are all things that we need to look at. Okay, let's go on to one more slide. Okay. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of the things that we are commonly coming across, certainly on our forums in our disease area. So the alkaline diet, and I particularly like this little picture because it kind of follows on from the publications that you have, you know, computing for dummies and you know, healthy eating for dummies and all those kind of things. So the alkaline diet is again come along from this issue that we talked about on the previous slide about the difference between correlation and causality. And what happened is somebody came up with a little bit of research that came in a clinical setting, so in a petri dish, in a test tube, if you like, that certain tumors, when they are badly supplied with blood, cause a little bit of acidity around the tumor. Now, this does not mean that your body becomes acidified. So you cannot change the pH of your blood by adding in bicarbonate of soda or lemon juice or whatever else. You can quite clearly see your body is very carefully buffered. It will do its utmost to change the pH back to what it needs to function under. So don't fall for these things. So let's go on another one. One more slide. So, whoops, it's gone too fast. Okay, so the other one is the sugar feeds cancer myth. So in our field, obviously, as cancer, we hear a lot about sugar feeds cancer. And this is also another thing from correlation to causality. You know, everyone knows that fast multiplying cells needs a lot of sugar. And if we cut out the glucose from our diet, we can starve the cancer. But unfortunately, the problem is that healthy cells need glucose too. And one thing tumors are very good at is appropriating the energy they need from anything. So if you cut out sugar, it's going to get its energy from somewhere else. All your food is eventually made into sugar in some way or the other. So there is no evidence that following a sugar-free diet lowers the risk of getting cancer or boosts the chance of surviving. This little article in the Cancer Research UK site explains it very well and very simply, so it's worth looking at it. It's actually a very good blog for all kinds of other pseudoscience as well. Okay, so who is responsible for fighting pseudoscience? Well, basically, we all are. You know, physicians need to get involved in this. Researchers need to get involved in this. The media has a huge responsibility to make sure that what they produce is correct. Society as a whole, and of course, patients. We're all responsible for doing this. The problem is if you're trying to fight this, there's a quite nice little saying that came to be known as the Brandolini concept, which is that, you know, bullshit is very difficult to refute because it takes a lot of effort and time to refute it. But I particularly like this little quote. So let's go on one more slide. Okay, it's a bit of delay. Okay, so we've been dealing with this pseudoscience on our forums for a long time. We are extremely strict that no one can put anything on the forums without declaring where the source is. So where has it come from? And then this can lead to some discussion. So if it is pseudoscience, sometimes we take it off completely, and sometimes we use it as a lesson. Why is this pseudoscience? How can we take this apart? And in this way, we teach people to do what we call their own falsification, which is kind of nitpicking at something until you can't find anything else wrong with it. And very often, if it's pseudoscience, it usually fails, fairly early on, and we can clearly educate a whole bunch of people who are on the forum at once that this is nonsense. And in modern science is always assuming that we don't know the whole truth. And this is sometimes the problem, because the difference between what is science that hasn't yet had enough evidence and what is just complete rubbish that somebody is trying to make money out of is kind of a linear thing, and it's difficult to know where we are along that thing. But if you teach patients to always falsify, to always nitpick at things, to look at everything, then we're equipping them to be able to decide between good and bad. And I always like this quote of Bettina's, who's a colleague of mine: only when we've picked out anything that could be wrong can we say it's more or less right. And that at least only for now, because obviously, research is changing all the time. Okay, let's do the next one. Oops, one more back. Sorry, back to the pyramid. Nope, it's going forward. Can we go back? I don't seem to have the ability on my screen. That's perfect, perfect. Okay, so the first thing we start with is telling people what the hierarchy of scientific evidence is. So, and I always think the pyramid of proof, as we call it, is very useful, because we see from this that right at the bottom is a case report. So we saw in the pseudoscience example that they always cite one case report. Down there at the bottom is also the opinion of our clinicians, the opinion of editors. So that's also at the bottom. So whenever you're talking to your clinician, they should also be citing evidence that is much higher up the pyramid. So, and then we see animal trials and in vitro, which basically means in the test tube studies. Then we have cross-sectional studies, case control studies, cohort studies, which is studies with large cohorts of patients. Then we have randomized controlled trials, and then we have meta-analysis of those randomized controlled trials. So that's when they gather all the trials that have been done in that area. In the rare space, there's very few, unfortunately, so meta-analyses are not always possible. But it gives you a good idea of what you should expecting, and you should always be asking the evidence above that, if possible. Okay, so we go on one. Okay, so we teach our people where to find accurate, trustworthy, and up-to-date information. And to do this, you need the right source. And this is why we always insist on our forums that source must be declared. And it's very interesting. Once you say this once on the forum, you will have 100 patients saying, as soon as something's posted, where's the source of that? And it's a wonderful educational tool, really. So high impact factor publications, all publications are listed according to the number of times they are cited by other clinicians, other scientists. So high impact factor publications are things like the New England Medical Journal, Science, Nature, Lancet, those kind of things. PubMed also will have all the publications in there of decent citations. And then also you've got, in our field certainly, you've got the publications coming out of the big international conferences. So in our case, in oncology, it's ASCO and ESMO, but in different disease areas, you'll have your own conferences, and those are usually pretty good sources. Okay, one more on. Okay, so what we want evidence. It has to be first accurate, so it's evidence-based and not eminence-based. We quite like this because if a clinician says to you, I think this, as we've seen from before, that's eminence-based, and you should be saying, okay, where's the actual evidence for this? Excuse me. So, and then it also needs to be dated, because old data is dangerous. And then it needs to be referenced. Excuse me, I'm just going to take a drink. Okay, accessible. If you can't put it simply, you don't understand it. So this is the ultimate in accessibility. It should be simple. Then we have enabling. It should teach patients to continue to educate themselves and be proactive. So If it makes you feel like I can't go on, this is way too complicated, then it's not enabling, and we should be trying to avoid this. Okay, next slide. So we did at ESMO last year a little experiment to see if some of the publications that our patients were using actually satisfied some of our criteria. And you can actually see that it doesn't. Even our website was a little bit behind the times as it should be. So you can actually have readability scores are quite a useful one. It gives you an idea of how accessible it is to people. But if you're reading a scientific paper, it's always going to not be readability, because the moment you put anything non-scientific in there, it will be it'll put the readability score out of what it should be. Okay, excuse me. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we actually came up with a tool which we are actually also using in the Share4Rare platform, which is a patient information review tool. And it goes through different sections. And I think, you know, if we're producing information ourselves as patient organizations, or if we're looking through information, we should just test it all the time for these four things, which is validity, verifiability, so the source and everything like we've already discussed, accessibility, the language it's used in, and agency, how enabling it is, and does this actually encourage us to go and find out more information. Okay, let's go on one more. So on our forums, there's a big problem, because there is a difference between pseudoscience that's replacing or harming the treatment we're taking, and then those that are used in strategies for coping with a disease. And it's a very sensitive area, because I am never going to say to someone that the trauma that you receive with a diagnosis, you shouldn't be finding things to help you cope. And we even know that the placebo effect works. So we shouldn't be being cruel to people and criticizing people for using certain therapies that may not have the evidence that would harm them if it was replacing treatment or something. I mean, for an example, lots of people use homeopathy. Now, there isn't actually very good clinical evidence for this. It's more or less okay as a placebo, but we also need to be careful, because there are contraindications, like in St. John's wort is actually bad for certain treatments. So we should really discuss this with our clinicians and try and get some discussion going about these things. But then if people want to say that they're coping with the disease by using Reiki or using mindfulness, which has some proven benefits, we should also be supporting them, even though there's not the best evidence out there for this. And this is certainly something, when you discuss it with your doctor or your clinician, or whatever specialist you're seeing, this is something that a decent clinician will be very happy to discuss with you. Certainly at the ESMO conference, we had a great oncologist, and he said he was delighted when his patients brought up the subjects of complementary or alternative therapy, because it meant that there was a dialogue. And sometimes you will get clinicians who will basically send a patient away saying something like, "Don't waste my time with this rubbish. I practice Western evidence-based medicine." And all that happens then is that you lose that patient out into the ether, and they're lost. And you also lose the confidence of your patient, and that's the worst thing that can happen. So I think never be afraid to discuss these things with your clinician, and try and educate them a little bit on how to deal with it, and not just be completely negative about it. Next one. Okay, so here we have some pretty good resources on pseudoscience. I want to just go through these little bit by little because we have evidence-based resources. So if you look on Wikipedia, there's lists of unproven and disproven cancer therapies, and you'll find this in all kinds of disease areas, which are pretty useful because there's lots and lots of references that go with this. Another few I like is Quackwatch, which I haven't got on here, but Edzard Ernst is a very famous alternative medicine tester, if you like. He was Professor Emeritus of Alternative Medicine at Exeter University, and he's been fighting pseudoscience for a very long time with very good logic, and he has an excellent blog where you can just discuss these things. I Hate Pseudoscience is another one. Quackwatch is another one. Always go and test these things out, because just like if there's issues with your what you're getting, your spam you're getting, with problems that you have on the internet, you will go and check out whether this is something that's known about and whether it's just a fraud. We should also do the same with our health, in fact, even more so. And also on Wikipedia, you can find all the topics that are characterized as pseudoscience. So that's a pretty useful tool to go and have a look at. And I would just say, again, on forums, we need to be sensitive to this. We need to have rules. We need to decide what rules we're going to have, and that we're going to share these rules, and that we also have to be sympathetic, and we have to be understanding that patients are going to be looking for these therapies. I just want to go back a little bit, because there was one slide we glossed over a little bit, if I can control it. Onto the, no, let me go forward, a little bit forward. I just want to talk a little bit more about this patient information tool. This is something we can share with everyone. And it's the validity of this tool. If you can pass this through the information that you have, or the information you want to test, you can pretty much, if you're talking about a score above 10 or hopefully 15 to 19, then that's going to be a reliable source. You may fail on things like agency, like if it's very complicated science because it's a clinical trial paper, you're not going to necessarily understand all of it, and that might maybe be a bit disabling, but it's about persistence. And all of this falsification, the falsification we were talking about earlier, all of this is all tools that we should be training our patients in, and it all takes practice. And if we don't individually practice this, we won't get any better at it. Let's go back on a little bit more. Okay, oops, so it's gone too far. Okay, so one more back. So I'd just like to encourage you all to falsify, to support people with pseudoscience, to try and learn from it. Don't just take it off sometimes, because you can actually use it as a very good example of how to teach people to do it. And please come up with any questions. And I do apologize for my coughing and my voice, but please, let's have some questions.
Julie, thank you so much for your time giving this incredibly useful webinar. And I know that you've been incredibly busy with all kinds of conferences and meetings, but I really appreciate the time that you're taking for it. And even with your cracked voice, you give valuable information, and it only shows, for me at least, how incredibly passionate you are about this. So thank you very much on this. As Julie just said, in the chat box, you can ask your questions. I've already have some questions, because we were talking about some good resources. Do you have some resources that immediately raise a red flag with you, that you see posted a lot?
Yes, anything that comes from a poor source, a low impact factor source. If it doesn't come from one of the good publications that you already know about, then you should question it. Then you can go and look and see that there are many tools that you can use that tell you what the impact factor of the publication that is being sourced. And you can actually see, oh, this is not even on the list of impact factor, so therefore it's not a good source. Or if it's halfway down, you can guarantee that, you know, it's not the best place to be getting this information from. And you can maybe even go searching to see if this same data is in a better publication. If it's not, you can pretty much guarantee that that's the nitpicking that's telling you, watch out for this. And we do this, you can do this in kind of traditional science, if you like. And we certainly had a case on our forum recently where we had a patient that was spending a huge amount of money, hundreds of thousands of euros, to go to a clinic in Germany to have a treatment that is known to work in other treatments. In this case, it was an immunotherapy, which is very expensive, but it was not, has not been tested or used in this indication, this particular indication that this woman was going for. Now that is as much pseudoscience as if somebody was telling you to eat mud from the Dead Sea. It's as much pseudoscience. So we shouldn't just be critical of the plant-based and this, that. We should also be critical of the medical-based in terms of product-based, but if it's wrong indication, it is still pseudoscience. Any more questions?
As I can see through the chat box, not anymore. I would like to ask you one more question, because you were talking about the selective information bias that most patients have in the beginning. Can you give an example of a selective information bias that you yourself had in your beginning and how you dealt with that? I'm sorry, I can't hear you. You have to unmute yourself.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes, sorry. Okay, so yes, we had this same issue because when my husband first got cancer, you start looking at everything. You start looking to change your diet totally. You start looking to exercise furiously, all the things, all the myths, if you like, around cancer. Now, we know that taking exercise, a good amount of exercise is good for you. We know that eating healthily is good for you. We were pretty much sort of doing that. And then I found a little bit of evidence that came out of the Lancet, which said that in melanoma, not in other cancers, it must be said, if you had a higher BMI than average, than normal, you actually responded better to the immunotherapies that he was using. Now, this was totally against what the common perception that I had. And I must say, I certainly did say to my husband, oh, don't worry about losing weight, if stay a little chubby. And because it came out of the Lancet, I was reasonably secure that there was probably some evidence behind it. And it may be, they don't really know why yet, but it could be something to do with inflammation, which means that the immunotherapies work a little bit better. But it was an interesting concept because it sort of blew away my previous misconceptions. And certainly in eating, that's something we had a fairly healthy diet anyway, but it's certainly something we changed. Not necessarily evidence-based also, but we're quite pragmatic about it. And certainly in coping mechanisms, you need to find something that works for you, both as a carer and as a patient. And that's less important as long as it doesn't interfere in your treatment or change your choices of treatment.
Okay, thank you very much. As I can see, we don't have any more questions in the chat box, so I think we're going to leave it for here. If you have any questions that arise after the webinar, you can always ask them via info@shareforrare.org, or you can follow us on social media and just follow along what we're going to do. Julie, thank you so much, and thank all the attendees for listening, and we hope to upload this on YouTube as soon as possible so you can spread the message. Thank you all very much for attending and hope to see you next time. Goodbye.